There is a moment that happens to almost everyone who retires, usually somewhere in the first few weeks after the last paycheck arrives, and the reality of the new situation settles in. The moment is this. The person sits down, opens the account, looks at the number, and feels something unexpected. Not anxiety, not relief exactly. Something closer to disorientation, because the number is the largest number they have ever seen associated with their own name. It represents decades of work and discipline and deferred gratification, and it is sitting there, available, in a way that nothing in their financial life has ever been available before. That moment of disorientation is where most of the expensive mistakes begin. Not because the person is foolish, not because they have not been careful, but because everything they learned about money over the previous 40 years was about accumulation. Save more, spend less, let it grow, do not touch it. Those were the rules. Those rules worked. And now the rules have changed completely, in ways that nobody explained clearly, at a moment when the consequences of getting it wrong are permanent rather than correctable. Here is what I have observed over many years of watching people navigate this transition. The financial decisions made in the first 5 years of retirement have a disproportionate effect on whether the money lasts 15 years or 30. Not the decisions made during the accumulation phase, not the investment choices made at 40 or 50. The decisions made in the window immediately after retirement begins, when the habits of a lifetime need to change completely, and most people do not know the change is necessary. Those decisions determine more about the retirement outcome than almost anything that came before them. Nearly half of Americans who retire this year will outlive their savings if they follow the withdrawal patterns that feel natural and intuitive in the early years of retirement. That is not a projection designed to frighten. It is a documented pattern with a documented cause. And the cause is almost never recklessness. It is almost always the application of the wrong framework to a moment that requires a completely different one. I want to walk through what that different framework looks like, not in abstract terms. In the specific decisions and specific patterns that I have watched determine the difference between people who arrived at 80 with genuine financial security and people who arrived at 78 needing to have conversations they never expected to have. The first thing I want to address is something that almost nobody explains to people before they retire, and that produces more financial damage in the early years of retirement than almost any other single factor. The sequence in which you withdraw money from different accounts matters as much as the total amount you have. Most people think about retirement savings as a single number, the total, what I have, and they approach the question of withdrawals as a simple subtraction problem. I need this much per month, so I take this much per month, and eventually the number gets smaller until it reaches zero, or I do. But that is not how the accounts actually work. Most people approaching retirement have money in multiple types of accounts. A traditional 401k or IRA where contributions were made pre-tax, and where every withdrawal will be taxed as ordinary income. A Roth account where contributions were made after tax, and where qualified withdrawals are completely tax-free. Taxable brokerage accounts with their own tax treatment, and Social Security, which has its own set of rules about timing and taxation. The order in which these accounts are accessed, which one gets touched first, which one gets left alone the longest, when Social Security gets activated, has consequences that compound over time into very large numbers. I watched 2 men retire within months of each other, with nearly identical account balances. One of them had thought carefully about the sequencing of his withdrawals. The other had not, and simply began drawing from his largest account because it was the most obvious choice. 10 years later, the man who had thought about sequencing had meaningfully more money, despite having spent at approximately the same rate. The difference was not investment performance. It was tax efficiency compounded over a decade of withdrawals. The general principle, and this is not tax advice, this is an observation about patterns, is that allowing tax-advantaged accounts to continue growing while drawing from taxable sources first, and delaying Social Security as long as circumstances permit, tends to produce better outcomes over a long retirement than the intuitive approach of simply drawing from whatever is largest or most accessible. The specifics depend on individual circumstances, and warrant a conversation with someone who can look at the full picture. But the principle that sequencing matters, that the order is not neutral, is something every person over 65 should understand before they make the first withdrawal. The second pattern I want to describe is one I call the first-year problem, and it is so consistent across the retirements I have observed that I've come to think of it as almost universal. The first year of retirement is almost always the most expensive year of retirement, and the excess spending of that first year has consequences that extend far beyond the year itself. Here is why it happens. A person retires after decades of deferred living. Trips that were planned and postponed, home projects that waited, time with family that was always in competition with work obligations. And suddenly the time is there. The freedom is real, and the money that has been accumulating for 40 years feels, for the first time, like it is supposed to be used. So it gets used. Generously, joyfully, in ways that feel entirely justified given how long they were waiting. The problem is not the spending itself. The problem is the rate. A sustainable long-term withdrawal rate from a retirement portfolio, one that gives the money a reasonable chance of lasting through a 25 or 30-year retirement, is typically in the range of 3.5% to 4% annually. Many people in their first year of retirement spend at 2 or 3 times that rate without realizing it, because each individual expenditure feels like a one-time thing rather than a rate. The vacation is not a rate. The renovation is not a rate. The gifts to the children and grandchildren are not a rate. But added together across 12 months, they produce a rate. And that rate, applied in the first year when the portfolio is at its largest and most vulnerable, depletes a foundation that was supposed to compound through the following decades. I knew a woman who retired at 66 with $600,000 saved. By the end of her second year of retirement, she had spent nearly $140,000 of it. Not frivolously. On real things. A trip she had promised herself for 30 years. A kitchen renovation that had waited a decade. Help with her daughter's wedding. A car to replace the one that had finally given out. Each decision individually defensible. Together they represented a withdrawal rate that would exhaust her savings before she reached her early 80s. When she finally sat down with someone who showed her what the trajectory looked like if she continued, the conversation that followed was one of the harder ones I have witnessed. The first year sets a psychological baseline that is very difficult to move downward. What felt like a reasonable spending level in year 1 becomes the expectation for year 2 and year 3. Building a realistic and sustainable withdrawal budget before retirement begins, and treating the first year as a test of that budget, rather than a reward for having arrived, is among the most important financial decisions of the retirement transition. The third pattern is the one that I find most technically important and most consistently misunderstood, and it is the reason that 2 people can retire with identical account balances and have completely different outcomes, depending on when the market decides to have a bad year. When you are withdrawing money from a portfolio at the same time the portfolio is losing value, the damage is not simply additive, it is multiplicative. And it is permanent in a way that market losses during the accumulation phase are not. Let me make this concrete. During the accumulation phase, a market decline of 30% in a given year is painful to watch, but ultimately recoverable. The contributions continue. The shares are purchased at lower prices. When the market recovers, the portfolio recovers, and often ends up in a stronger position than if the decline had never happened. Time is working for you. The decline is a temporary condition. During the distribution phase, the same 30% decline in the same year produces a completely different result if withdrawals are continuing at the same rate. The portfolio is selling shares at depressed prices to fund the withdrawals. Fewer shares remain to participate in the recovery, and the recovery, when it comes, applies to a smaller base than would have existed if the withdrawals had been reduced or paused during the downturn. The damage from a bad sequence of returns in the early years of retirement, what the financial literature calls sequence of returns risk, can permanently alter the trajectory of a portfolio in ways that have nothing to do with the long-term average return of the investments themselves. I watched this play out in real time in 2008. 2 men I knew retired within a year of each other with similar balances. Both experienced the same market decline. One of them reduced his withdrawals aggressively during the downturn, drawing from a small cash reserve he had set aside specifically for this purpose, and allowed his invested assets to remain intact through the recovery. The other continued withdrawing at his planned rate because the budget required it, and he had no alternative reserve to draw from. 5 years later, the difference in their account balances was not explained by their investment choices. It was explained by what happened to their portfolios during 18 months when the market was down, and one of them was selling assets at the bottom to cover living expenses. The practical implication of this is that every person entering retirement should have a cash reserve, not invested, not subject to market fluctuation, that covers 1 to 2 years of living expenses and exists specifically to be used during market downturns, so that the invested portfolio does not have to be touched at its lowest point. This reserve is not an emergency fund in the traditional sense. It is a sequence of returns buffer. Its purpose is to protect the portfolio during the period when it is most vulnerable to permanent damage. The fourth pattern is one that I described briefly at the beginning, and want to return to because the psychological dimension of it is as important as the mathematical one. The number in the retirement account on the day you stop working is the largest number most people have ever seen associated with their own name. And that number creates an illusion of abundance that does not survive honest arithmetic. Take any retirement balance and divide it by 25. That quotient is approximately what the account can sustainably produce per year over a long retirement. A $500,000 balance produces approximately $20,000 per year before taxes. $1 million produces approximately $40,000. These are not small numbers in isolation, but they are the numbers that need to cover everything the paycheck used to cover, for a period of time that could extend 30 years or more. The people I watched deplete their savings faster than their plans projected almost universally failed to do this arithmetic clearly and early. The number felt large in absolute terms. It was large in absolute terms, but it was not large relative to what it needed to accomplish over the time it needed to accomplish it. And spending in the early years as though it were large in absolute terms, rather than as though it were a finite resource with a specific productive capacity, is the error that shows up consistently in the retirements that run into trouble. Before any significant withdrawal decision is made, do the division. Whatever the balance is, divide it by 25 and look at the annual number that produces. Then divide that number by 12 and look at the monthly number. That monthly number is the constraint, not the total balance. The total balance is a sum of monthly constraints spread across decades. Keeping that monthly number in view, rather than the impressive total, is the orientation that produces sustainable withdrawal behavior. The fifth pattern involves investment allocation, and it is a mistake that comes from a completely understandable emotional place and produces quietly devastating results over a long retirement. When people retire, the instinct is to move everything to safety. The accumulation phase required accepting risk because time was available to recover from losses. Now, time is shorter. The impulse to protect what was built is entirely rational, and so the accounts get moved, fully or largely, into conservative positions. Bonds, cash equivalents, fixed income instruments that will not lose value when the market falls. The problem is that a retirement that lasts 30 years is not a short-term financial situation. It is a long-term financial situation that happens to be in its distribution phase. And the money that will not be needed for 10 or 15 years has 10 or 15 years to grow if it is positioned to do so. Moving it to low-yield conservative positions at the moment of retirement, because the emotional environment calls for safety, means that money does not grow during exactly the period when it could have been growing without meaningful risk of being needed before recovery was possible. The people who managed 30-year retirements successfully did not treat the retirement account as a single pool to be managed with a single strategy. They thought about the money in segments. The money needed in the next 3 years was held conservatively because it would be needed soon and could not afford a loss. The money needed in years 4 through 10 was held in balanced positions that could absorb some volatility with time to recover. The money not needed for a decade or more was held in positions oriented toward growth, because a decade is enough time for the market to do what it historically does. This segmentation, sometimes called a bucket strategy, is not complicated, but it requires thinking about the money in time-based segments, rather than as a single number to be protected uniformly. The sixth pattern is the one that almost everyone knows is coming, and almost no one plans for adequately. Healthcare costs in retirement are consistently and significantly underestimated. Not because people do not know they will have healthcare costs, but because the honest calculation of what those costs will be over a 20 or 25-year retirement produces a number that most people prefer not to look at directly. A couple retiring today at 65 can expect to spend, on average, somewhere in the range of $300,000 on healthcare costs over the course of their retirement. That number includes premiums, out-of-pocket costs, dental, vision, and long-term care expenses that Medicare does not cover. It does not include the scenario where one or both members of the couple requires extended care, assisted living, memory care, skilled nursing, which can add costs that dwarf everything else in the retirement budget. I watched a couple navigate this with more grace than most. They had planned well. They had saved adequately. They had a sustainable withdrawal strategy. At 74, the husband developed a condition that required a level of care their plan had not specifically accounted for. The costs were not catastrophic in the first year. They were manageable in the second year. By the third year, the cumulative effect of costs that Medicare covered partially but not fully had altered the financial picture in ways that required adjustments they had not anticipated making. Not because they had been careless, because the number they had assigned to healthcare in their retirement plan was based on what they hoped, rather than what an honest actuarial assessment would have produced. The practical response to this pattern is to build healthcare costs into the retirement budget at a level that feels slightly uncomfortable, higher than you expect to need, conservative enough to absorb an outcome that is worse than average. The money that is not spent on healthcare does not disappear. It remains available for other things. The money that healthcare costs exceed the budget produces a problem that is very difficult to solve at 75. The seventh pattern brings everything together, and is the one I want to close with because it is the principle that underlies every specific decision in the distribution phase of retirement. The 4% rule, the guideline that suggests withdrawing 4% of a retirement portfolio annually, provides a reasonable probability of the money lasting 30 years, is a starting point, not a guarantee. And it fails in predictable circumstances that every person over 65 should understand before they establish their withdrawal rate. It fails when the retirement is long. A 35-year retirement funded at 4% carries meaningfully more risk of depletion than a 25-year retirement at the same rate. People who retire at 62 or 63 and live into their 90s are operating in territory where 4% is not a conservative assumption. It fails when the early years of retirement coincide with poor market performance. The sequence of returns problem described earlier applies directly to the 4% rule. The rule was derived from historical data that includes many sequences of returns. It does not protect against the specific sequence that begins with a significant downturn. It fails when healthcare costs are not incorporated realistically into the spending assumption. If the 4% withdrawal is expected to cover everything, including healthcare, and healthcare costs are underestimated by the amount most people underestimate them, the effective withdrawal rate is higher than 4% from the beginning. The people I watched sustain their portfolios through long retirements tended to operate at rates closer to 3 to 3.5% in the early years, building in a margin that gave the portfolio resilience against the conditions that caused the 4% rule to fail. They treated the difference between their actual withdrawal rate and the 4% ceiling as a reserve, not money they planned to spend, but room in the plan that existed to absorb the unexpected. The unexpected, in a 30-year retirement, is not a possibility. It is a certainty. The only variable is what form it takes. What I want to leave you with is the thing I said at the beginning, stated plainly. The financial skills that got you to retirement are not the financial skills that will get you through it. The accumulation phase rewarded saving, patience, and inaction. The distribution phase requires active management of sequence risk, withdrawal sequencing, spending rates, allocation across time horizons, and healthcare cost planning. These are not the same skills. They are not even the same orientation. And the transition between them is one of the most consequential financial moments of a person's life. The people who navigated it well did not necessarily have more money than the people who struggled. They had a clearer understanding of what the moment required and made their decisions accordingly. The people who struggled applied the habits and intuitions of the accumulation phase to a situation those habits were not designed for, and discovered the mismatch slowly and expensively over the first 5 years. Watch this again if you need to. Write down the patterns. Have the conversation with someone who can look at your specific situation. But above all, recognize that the moment you are in right now, the moment of transition from building to using, is not the time to rely on intuition and habit. It is the time to understand exactly what you are doing and why before you touch anything. The savings took 40 years to build. They deserve at least this much attention before the spending begins.